All right, I think we're good. We are continuing in our study of Acts chapter 7. We have discussed the first 6 chapters. First 6 chapters in Acts. We've caught up to date on where we are. We talked last week that Stephen is in front of the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders of the time. It's a few years after Christ's death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Church and the Holy Spirit have partnered. We see the early messaging from Peter and John. We see them. We see a warning, a strict warning. Do not preach in the name of Christ. They even beat him up a little bit just to prove a point. And so what we see is thousands being added to the church. Thousands and thousands of people. So as some issues came up, you guys may recall, some issues came up about in this communal living style, in some of the food distribution and attention being given to some and not others. The idea was raised to have the apostles sort of back away from that and elect 7 men who were going to handle sort of the day-to-day operations. And so because they're going to handle that, it gives the apostles a chance, apostles like Peter, to kind of back away a little bit. And so because of that, well, of the 7, which we talked about last week, Stephen was one of them. Stephen was a man. Let's go there, Acts chapter 6. In verse 8, it reads, "And Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and signs among the people." And so he is one of these 7. He's doing some fantastic things. He's certainly proclaiming the name of Christ, the message of Christ, and he is being accused of blasphemy. Stephen was canceled by the religious leaders of the time. Canceling, not good. Okay? And so Stephen is thrust in front of the Sanhedrin, and they say, "What's going on?" And so at the end of chapter 6, they actually come up with false witnesses. They actually come to people and say, "Will you say in a public forum or against Stephen, let's make some things up. And let's accuse him of things that he didn't do. Let's put out some false accusations." And so, because of those accusations, he was brought before the Sanhedrin. They set up false witnesses in verse 13, said, "This man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place," meaning the temple and the law. "We've heard him say this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place, change the customs which Moses delivered to us all." And so they're accusing him of some things specifically for Christ and against Moses. Remember that as we go through Acts chapter 7, because he's going to talk about both of those. He's going to talk about both of them pretty intently, because everything that he says in chapter 7 is going to point right to Christ. Okay? Now, he wraps it up and summarizes it and goes after him in verse 51. So what does that imply? That there are 50 verses in which he is going to give them a history of their own nation. And he's going to take the history and the history of the covenants that God made with these different men throughout the Old Testament, and he's going to point them all to Christ. And he's going to wrap it up. And then it says that they are also cut to the heart. So in verse 15, here's where we left it off. Acts 6:15, "And all who sat in the council." So Stephen's got their attention, okay? And everyone's looking at him. Kind of feels familiar. Hello. Everyone's looking at him. And as they're looking steadfastly, the New King James says, so they're looking steadfastly at him, they saw the face of an angel. That's where Stephen and I differ, Sean. All right. He had the face of an angel. Me, it's just me. So we see them looking at him, and they saw something different about his appearance. Okay. So that's where we left off last week. That he's about to give the messages of all messages. And he's going to throw down some history of the Old Testament in front of the experts of the Old Testament. Okay, so let's go. Stephen is facing Jewish leaders who oppose his teachings. How do we know they oppose his teachings? Because in chapter 6, they came up with false witnesses to oppose his teachings. Okay, so there wasn't too much of a line to draw there. They've already accused him of lies, and now he faces his accusers who are not fond of the name that he is currently preaching. Well, what's that name? This man does not speak blasphemous words. We've heard him say, Jesus of Nazareth will do this, and go against Moses. Remember, I said to remember that. He's pointing toward Christ, and they're accusing him of destroying what Moses created. That's not the case. These are not two different testaments. The Bible is one solid flow. There's not two separate things. Romans 11 tackles that. So Paul tackles that in Romans chapter 11. These are the same God, same covenant promises attached to the same thing. There's not one group in the Old Testament, maybe they'll make it, but the New Testament, they're in. It's not that. We're going to see a link between the two, and that's what Stephen's going to preach. His very life could be at stake. These same leaders had no problem killing the Savior, which Stephen had no doubt seen or was aware of, and now they face another teacher of the gospel. They knew they had to listen to Stephen and decide what to do based on his defense. What transpires is the greatest breakdown of covenant theology that has ever been preached. Now, Stephen knew his Bible. Okay? Stephen knew exactly who these people were. He was taught Torah from very young. He had a good understanding of what this was. And so he's going to make it clear that he's aware. What I do appreciate is this group giving him a forum. They could have easily just assumed, grabbed him, killed him, be done with it. But I think God is going to use this moment to really make an impact on those who were listening. How do we know that? Because at the end of chapter 7, what do we see? What do we see at the end of chapter 7? I'm going to spoil it right here, Sean. I'm going to spoil it, okay? At the end of chapter 7, the guy who was there was a young man named Saul of Tarsus. He saw the whole thing. He watched the whole thing. He heard the whole message. He held the coats for those who couldn't get to Stephen fast enough to shut him up. Okay? So we're going to see God's plan continue in the next phase with Saul. Okay? So that's how I know that there were people who were intently listening. So, and there's more here. These are the final words of this new group's first martyr, a number that will eventually top 50 million. Okay, which we're studying on Sundays. This is this is Stephen. All right, so here we go. Acts 1, 7:1. Then the high priest said, "Are these things so?" So as we witness to people, if they ask, "Tell me about the Bible," that should not be the answer. He's giving him a softball. Are these things so? Are you talking about Jesus as the Christ? Are you talking about Moses? Are you, everything you're accused of, is that true? Boy, he was ready to give a witness. He was ready to give an account. He didn't have to think about it. Hold on, let me look up a couple verses and I'll get back to you. Okay? He was ready. And so the same example should be for us. In fact, he starts off verse 2 by saying, "Fathers and brethren, listen. Pay attention to me, because what I'm about to say is going to blow your mind." Okay? And so, are these things so? Yes, the high priest wanted to know if what Stephen was accused of was in fact true. The accusations were that Stephen had spoken words against Moses and God and had spoken blasphemies against his holy place, this temple, and the law. Now, we know these were false accusations. We see that in chapter 6, because the Bible tells us the elders and scribes secretly induced men to say these things to get the people into a lather and get the attention of the Jewish leadership. They did the same thing with Christ. We looked at that last week. They had to come up with things with Jesus because They didn't have anything on him. And so they came up, they twisted things that he said. And so it starts with a few people and an agenda. Then it becomes these people working the crowds to get them worked up and convinced to believe that agenda. It eventually works its way into elected officials who need the support of the people for re-election or for support. And I know we're really thankful that this type of thing doesn't happen today. It takes a few, and they get them all lathered up. I probably just pulled something. You get them all lathered up. It takes a few, and that's what's happening, is a few of these leaders said, hey, let's come up with some false things and let's really get them going. Next thing you know, Jesus is being arrested and a murderer is being freed. That's how lathered up people can quickly get. And so we saw this in 2020. This was pretty much the entire 60s, certainly the back half. This is what happens. It takes a few people, and then they get placated. And next thing you know, we see stuff like this happening. And people blindly follow the mob. They blindly follow the mob. Oh, they're going this way. Oh, no, now they're going this way. Oh, now they're going this way. That's what happens. And so we have a group of people now against Stephen because of made up stuff. Okay? So, again, I know we all think about it and are thankful that this doesn't happen today. Whew. I'm glad that human behavior is over with. These are examples of just the last 5 years. Okay. And he said, brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you. And he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. From there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. How about that, God calling it shot? I'm going to give this land to your descendants. I don't have any children. Still going to give them to your descendants. Okay, God knew what he had in store. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them for 400 years. The nation to whom they would be in bondage, I will judge, said God. And after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begat Isaac, and circumcised him on the eighth day. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs. Okay? Familiar to us, I know. But remember, Stephen is preaching to people that this would also be familiar with. Okay? But remember where he's headed with this. Okay? So let's take a look. Stephen starts in on this leadership group by calling them brethren and fathers. Stephen did have respect for them and their position. He was raised to respect leadership. He takes them to the beginning of the covenant interaction of the Jews with Yahweh. Remember, prior to Abraham, God worked with mankind as a whole. He tried to work with humans and develop a relationship with them, starting with Adam and Eve, continuing with Noah, desiring to continue the work post-flood. What changed the plan to work with mankind as a whole? It was based on how quickly man was back to their evil ways. So we see this. It's fascinating to me that there's not much in the Bible about the time between Adam to Noah. Okay? It's always fascinated me. And there's a lot of research and things like that. But we do know that man's thoughts in his heart and in his mind were evil continually. So we do know that man had gotten severely wicked as they continued for that 2,000-year period. Then the flood happens, and they're right back to it. So now we're a generation or two past Noah, and we see them going right back to it. How do we know? Well, this should be a clue. The Tower of Babel showed clearly that man had no intention of following God as it once had. let's recap the Tower of Babel before we move forward.
After the flood, Noah and his family gave thanks and offered sacrifices to God for preserving them. God told Noah to go and multiply and fill the earth. Noah's family flourished and multiplied, but they did not spread all over the earth. Instead, they moved down from the mountains of Ararat and settled in the plain of Shinar and dreamed of building a great city. Come, let us build a city and a tower to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, looked down upon them and saw the city and the tower they were building. They are united and speak the same language. Now nothing they imagine to do will be impossible for them. So God went down and confused their language so they could not understand each other. And God scattered them over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. They left Babel by foot, by cart, and by boat. Because of the language barriers, each family group became isolated and developed distinct physical traits and cultures. But all came from the three sons of Noah, so they all share the same genes and all share the same promise of the Savior, the seed which God promised to Adam in the Garden of Eden.
Does anyone know that story? The event of the Tower of Babel? Of course. Of course. So we see that as a huge part. That, they believe, is the remnants of it. Tower of Babel remains are in modern-day Iraq. 440 BC, Greek historian Herodotus wrote, it was a solid central tower, 1 furlong square, with a second erected on top of it, and a third, and so on up to 8. All 8 towers can be climbed by a spiral way running around the outside, and about halfway up there are seats for those who make the journey to rest on. So again, just an interesting side note in history, but that's where God confused the languages. When you have to have an interpreter like a new Dodgers player who now has issues, we see that happening. It's because of the language barriers God mixed all of that up. So hopefully they'll get all that figured out. This event caused God. So let's start with Abraham. Stephen starts with Abraham. Okay. Recently, a brand new book was written on this exact topic. It's called The Abrahamic Covenant. I have a signed copy by the author. Got it while I was up in Citrus Heights. The author has known me for a long time. I've known him a long time. And he wrote a 364-page book on the Abrahamic Covenant. We will not be covering that entire book in this lesson for time constraint purposes. However, in many of the writings, I've gleaned some of that information onto this for this covenant. So this event caused God to choose one person to begin working with, and with whom he will funnel all promises and blessings. Shortly after Tower of Babel is the book of Genesis, chapter 12, in which he selects a faithful man. We see this in Hebrews 11. A faithful man named Abraham, Abram at the time. And he says, you're faithful. Faithful to what? Well, faithful to the order of service that God had clearly instructed. How do we know that Abel's service was acceptable and Cain's was not? Well, because God had a way in which service was acceptable. And Cain didn't follow it, Abel did. Cain was jealous, Cain killed Abel. Okay? So God had an acceptable way. Abraham was faithful in that. We see the writer of Hebrews saying that in chapter 11. And we see it in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. God had an order and a way of service that he accepted of mankind in general. However, as he looked around for faithfulness on the earth, one stood out. Abram was a man who was described as faithful and served Yahweh faithfully. We see in Hebrews 11, as the writer recaps, those most faithful in Israel's history. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs of him of the same promise, for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Okay, so Abraham had promises to him. God is now going to funnel these promises through this man, Father Abraham, right? Which we all know that song. He had many sons, right? But Father Abraham at the time was the one, before he was a father, that God saw was faithful. Abraham was called by God to go into a land where God would bless him, give him promises that would extend forever. The covenant between God and Abraham was an agreement, a pact, in which both sides had responsibilities. Now, this term covenant isn't really used a whole lot anymore. And we don't use the word, think of a time in your life recently where you've used the word covenant. All right? It's not a common word anymore. But yet here's what we see. The word covenant, not really used in modern conversation, is quite commonly used in legal, social, or marriage, and in theological context. So a covenant is a binding, an agreement. We'll see. It presupposes two or more parties who come together to make a contract, agreeing on promises, stipulations, privileges, and responsibilities. I think of my wife and her background in real estate. There were signed documents, covenanted, in which if you signed this, you were responsible for that. But it also meant the other signing party had responsibilities in it as well. And so it's an agreement. It's a contract. And so we see that in legal situations. We certainly see if I give a $5,000 retainer to an attorney and I sign paperwork saying you are my attorney, he then has responsibilities to fight for whatever the issue is that you need an attorney for. And as you see on television and on billboards, there's many attorneys around here who especially enjoy a good car accident. And so we see that happen a lot, but it's a binding agreement. Isn't marriage an agreement? Marriage is an agreement between two people. This for that, this for that. It's an agreement. It's a covenant. It's the covenant of marriage in which there are promises, stipulations, privileges, and responsibilities. Now, in political situations, it can be translated treaty. In a social setting, it means a lifelong friendship agreement. Right? We agree. Hey, have you heard the term, I've got your back? I like that one. What does that mean? Well, it means if this guy who's playing basketball over here comes and beats you up, gives you a black eye, then I'm going to defend you and go after him. Okay? Or what have you. Pick a situation. And so that's the idea. The Hebrew term, berith, for covenant, is from a root with a sense of cutting. Now, this is interesting. How many have heard this term of cutting, this concept? Okay, we're going to explain it. The term of cutting. So you've heard the term cutting a covenant. We're cutting an agreement. Okay? Because parts or covenants were made by passing between two pieces of flesh of an animal sacrifice. So covenants were often sealed by severing an animal with the implication that the party who breaks the covenant would then fall to the same fate. So it was an intentional, we're going to cut this animal in half, we're going to walk through it to see the damage, and if we break a covenant, then may the same thing happen to us. It was a bonded agreement. In this case, wishing death on someone who was in agreement. Now, Obviously took it way more seriously back then. Now, especially in the political world and in other, sometimes bosses and work situations, sometimes people don't keep their promises, okay? And I know, Sister Patty, it's surprising. Politicians sometimes don't keep their promises, and I understand your confusion on that, believe me. But it's true. And so if people were held to this standard, people would probably keep their word a little bit more, okay? But this is the idea. So it's called cutting a covenant. That's what that word means. The root word for that means. The preferred meaning of this Old Testament word is bond. Covenant refers to two or more parties bound together. The New Testament word for covenant has usually been translated as covenant, but testimony and testament have also been used. There is, what are the two parts of the Bible? Say again, loud. New Testament and Old Testament. This member in Missoula, years ago, bless her heart, she said that she was glad that her Bible had the New and Used Testament. New and used. Bless her heart. That's kind of funny. Apparently she was in the market for a car. It's New and Old Testament, New and Old Covenant. Old Covenant, New Covenant, split into two different sections. The Greek word diatheke usually is translated covenant in the New Testament. It's a legal term denoting a formal and legally binding declaration of benefits to be given by one party to another with or without conditions attached. Okay? So it's a strong agreement. And so when we say that this is a covenant book written to a covenant people by a covenant God, God takes it seriously. And the people who agree to take this seriously under covenant with God should take their portion seriously. As we're going to see, there's a covenant that's going to be cut with the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abram. God took that covenant seriously. Israel eventually did not. That's what Stephen's going to talk about. That you have to hold up your end of the bargain here. Hold up your end of the covenant, of the agreement. So in modern language, this word is used in the popular phrase, last will and testament. Here's the binding last things of agreement that I'm leaving to whomever at the time of death. Any questions on any of this? Just kind of defining what the word covenant means. Simply means an agreement. Okay. When Abimelech and Isaac decided to settle their land dispute, they made a binding agreement, a league, or a covenant to live in peace. An oath confirmed it. We see this in the book of Genesis, chapter 26. Okay, Abimelech and Isaac, the descendant of Abraham. Joshua and the Gibeonites bound themselves by oath to live in peace together in Joshua chapter 9. Although Yahweh commanded that Israel was not to bind themselves to the people living in the land of Canaan. How many people remember this story? The Gibeonites were from a far, they were close. They pretended to be from a far country. They put on ratty clothes. They got moldy bread. So it seemed like they were from a long ways away. They traveled a long ways away, but they were neighbors. They saw Israel's destruction of Jericho. They saw Israel's eventual destruction of Ai, and they were nervous. So they made an agreement, although deceitfully, made an agreement with Israel as Israel was progressing deeper into the land. The Gibeonites feigned distance by saying, look, we have tattered clothes, we have moldy bread, we're from so far away you'll never see us, but just in case, let's agree to be friends. Yeah, best friends, okay? And so that's what they did. So in this case, they made a covenant with Israel to have each other's backs, okay? Solomon and Hiram made a binding agreement to also live and work in peace together. We see that in 1 Kings chapter 5. And of course, a friendship bond was sealed by oath between David and Jonathan. Again, a blood oath, a covenant, an agreement as friends. Okay? Do we have a good feel for this term covenant, what it means? Okay? We have to first get to the root cause. Just kidding. We first have to get to the root of the word to see what that word means, to then progress further. Because what he's going to talk about are the binding agreements from God to his people. And when he does that, he's going to link all of them to the bind to Christ. And so as he continues to move down the line of history, he's going to say covenant, covenant, covenant. And he's going to implicate Israel in breaking that covenant. In fact, one of his last words are, "You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. You always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you." Okay, he's going to say that in verse 51. And so, very important to have a good understanding of this word covenant. How is this in relation to us today? We'll get there. Okay? But we'll go through this message. The elements of covenant are embedded in Genesis. God, in his revelation of creation, presented himself as the creator. He created his image bearers and kept man and woman in a close relationship with himself and had them mirror or reflect and represent him within the created cosmos. Humanity was given stipulations or mandates. As image bearers, meaning they were made in the likeness and image of God, as image bearers, they were to maintain an intimate and obedient fellowship with their Creator. The Sabbath was to enhance this. Humanity was to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. This was to be done by establishing families. A man was to leave his parents, cleave to his wife. All of this is in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Okay? Becoming one flesh, they would have children. Did everyone read Acts 2? I just remembered the homework. I just remembered the homework. Thank you, Brother Derek. You sent it to me via mind meld like Spock. Shout out to you, Brother Eric. Did everyone read Acts 2? Yeah. Did you go like this just now? Live long and prosper, Brother Derek. Did everyone read Acts 2? If not, that's okay. Amen. All right. If I had gold stars, I'd pass them out. All right. We probably have some in there. Well, next time I'll bring them. Acts 2. Beautiful chapter. Absolutely beautiful chapter. The parallels. Peter talks a lot about what Stephen's going to talk about. 1. 2. At the end, the people hearing the message were convicted. They were convicted based on what was being taught. Okay? And so from there, we differ as far as their reaction. But they were convicted by the same Holy Spirit. Convicted those in Acts 2. They will convict the Sanhedrin here in Acts 7. Okay, good. I'm glad I remembered that. Thank you, Brother Derek. As families increased, community would be formed. This social mandate, thus, was an integral aspect of covenant. So was the cultural mandate. Man and woman were to cultivate or subdue subdue and rule over creation. When God saw all that he had done, he confirmed it, not by expressing an oath or performing a ratifying ceremony, but by declaring that it was good. This he confirmed by ceasing from creating activity and establishing that seventh day of rest, sanctity, and blessing. Seventh day of rest. Very important. And something that continues to play in God's overall plan for mankind. See this in Genesis 2. Yahweh, God, did more. He spoke even of assured blessings. He blessed Adam and Eve. He thus gave them ability and authority to serve as his covenant agents. He provided for their sustenance. We see that in Genesis 1:28. He also spoke of the possibility of disobedience. Remember what the stipulation was? That you'll have all of this, but don't eat of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We see that in Genesis chapter 2. The ideas of blessing life, the life that he had created through them, or the curse was to be death. Death as separation from God because of their sin. Death would be that separation, separated from God, because God had created perfect beings, sinless beings. Sin would have been the curse that separated them from him. Thus were also included. The forbidding of eating has been referred to as the probationary command. Yahweh's covenant agents were tempted by Satan. They doubted Yahweh's words. They accepted the lie. They fell. They broke the covenantal relationship between Yahweh and themselves. Creation was affected, for it too suffered the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin. It too began to groan. Paul brings this up in Romans chapter 8. And really a lot of the book of Romans has to do with sin, specifically sin and what it did. But Yahweh did not break his covenant with creation. He came to the fallen, shamed and humiliated image bearers, and set about restoring humanity to fellowship with and service for him. Yahweh, graciously maintaining his mandates, revealed that Adam and Eve could still work under them. Spiritual fellowship was restored by Yahweh's assurance that the woman's seed would be victorious over Satan and his seed. The social mandate was maintained. Adam and Eve as one flesh would continue to have offspring. However, pain would be suffered. Do you remember God saying this to Eve? That there will be pain and agony in childbirth because of this separation. The cultural mandate was still to be obeyed, but with your hands you will work, and you will work the ground, and you will have to till and garden, and it'll be labor, it'll be difficult, it'll be challenging as you have to work for what you get. All the elements of the creation covenant remained. Then Yahweh added another dimension to this covenantal relationship. He pronounced in germinal form his plan for the full redemption and restoration of his image bearers and their royalty, priestly, and prophetic roles with their attendant privileges and responsibilities. Yahweh revealed how this was to be done by adding to his creation covenant the redemptive and restorative promises and implied stipulations of faith and obedience. What would this be? How's man going to get back? He established what has been widely known as the covenant of grace. Okay? How is man going to get back? There will have to be the sacrifice that will come. And this is what will have to happen. Okay? So, it's just so good. This is just so good. It's all there. Brother Derek said this a few weeks ago. Christ was in the garden. He was there. Everything that God did in the Old Testament pointed to Christ. It's there. He's there for everything. And so even in this, I've got to change the plan a little, but that's okay. I'll send my son. He'll fix it. And that's what's happening. Ideally, God didn't want them to sin. Ideally, there wouldn't be that separation of death. But I'm going to send the one that will overcome death and restore us, mankind, back to this covenant. Okay, next week, we're going to talk about Noah and a covenant with Noah. First blush, what would be part of the Noahic covenant? What would be something that kind of is still around that we think of when we think of a Noahic covenant? Boom. I don't have a gold star, but I give you one. The covenant with Noah to never flood the earth again. It's there. We see it every time it rains. There it is. God's promise, his covenant. And God has not flooded the earth since. Now, it may seem like it back here sometimes, especially when it's clogged. But that's not a worldwide flood. That's just a backyard flood. Okay, that's different. That's okay. And as it's rushing down Cedar, just flying down, just the water. Seems like it, it's not. That's a worldwide flood. So we'll get into Noah next week. That is a quick of the Abrahamic covenant. Yes, it made that noise.